The heart of New York City pulsed with life. Car horns blared, people rushed down the sidewalks, and towering skyscrapers lit the night with a million pinpricks of light. Yet, tucked away in a quieter corner, there was an oasis of stillness amidst the perpetual motion. A sleek, modern building that stood somewhat apart from the hustle and bustle, the New York Sleep Research Facility. Inside, the facility was a stark contrast to the vibrant city outside. Cold, white light bathed the sterile walls. The air hummed with the quiet buzz of state-of-the-art equipment. The world within the facility seemed to be encased in a bubble, untouched by the relentless energy of the city. At the center of it all was Dr. Sarah Hayes. At 35, she had already made a name for herself in the field of sleep research. Driven, passionate, and intelligent, she carried a weight of determination that far outweighed her petite frame. Sarah was fueled by a personal mission. Her younger brother had tragically succumbed to fatal familial insomnia, a rare and incurable disorder. Her loss had driven her to devote her life to the mysteries of sleep, hoping to prevent others from suffering her brother's fate. Today was the beginning of a groundbreaking study, the longest, most intensive sleep deprivation experiment ever conducted. A hand-picked group of volunteers was set to go weeks without sleep under Sarah's careful observation. There was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air. Sarah felt it too, mixed with a twinge of anxiety. The upcoming weeks were a blank canvas, filled with countless unknowns. But she was ready, her determination unwavering. "Let's unravel the secrets that hide in the corners of wakefulness," Sarah murmured to herself as she prepared to meet the volunteers. She was about to step into uncharted territory, setting the stage for a journey that none of them could fully predict. The city that never sleeps outside the facility's walls had no idea about the sleepless ordeal that was about to unfold within. The New York Sleep Research Facility was located downtown, in the heart of Manhattan. Amidst the towering skyscrapers and endless city lights, stood the modern, sterile research facility. Inside, a group of individuals gathered, drawn together by a unique experiment that promised to change the world of sleep science. They were the brave or perhaps desperate volunteers, ready to give up sleep for an extended period, all in the name of research. Each volunteer had a unique story and reason for participating. There was Mark, a struggling writer in his late 20s. He saw this experiment as a way to challenge his creativity, and maybe even material for his next book. Anna, a middle-aged nurse, was looking to make some extra money to send back to her family in Florida. With 2 grown children in college, every penny mattered. Then there was Bobby, a young man with a dream to join the army. Insomnia had been his long-standing companion, and he hoped this experiment would offer some insights into his condition. And Lila, a PhD student, found the idea of contributing to science exciting. The youngest of the group, 18-year-old Jake, saw this as a thrilling adventure, an opportunity to do something unique before he went off to college. The volunteers, although strangers to each other, shared a common space, a large white room full of tables and all manner of games and books. The atmosphere was a mix of anticipation and apprehension. Quiet conversations filled the room as they began to familiarize themselves with each other, forming a fragile camaraderie. Dr. Sarah Hayes, the orchestrator of this sleep study, watched them from the observation room, her heart filled with a blend of hope and anxiety. These people were entrusting their lives and sanity to her. It was a responsibility she did not take lightly. As the city outside buzzed with life, oblivious to the experiment unfolding within its heart, the volunteers prepared for their first sleepless night. Little did they know that their journey was about to take them to places far beyond their imagination. Sarah greeted the volunteers warmly, masking her own mix of anticipation and anxiety. She was professional and composed, explaining the procedure in simple terms. They were to stay awake, aided by their surroundings filled with activities designed to keep drowsiness at bay. Meals would be provided at set times, and regular health checks would ensure their safety throughout the experiment. As night fell, the experiment commenced. The volunteers, brimming with enthusiasm and armed with endless coffee supplies, seemed up for the challenge. They engaged in various activities, playing cards, reading, conversing, and even running around the facility's indoor track to stave off sleep. There was laughter, cheer, and camaraderie. The first night passed without incident, and so the unprecedented journey into sleeplessness began. It was a time of excitement, the air filled with the buzzing energy of the volunteers and the quiet hum of the monitoring equipment. But as the hours turned into days, that initial enthusiasm would start to fade, replaced by the harsh reality of what it truly meant to go without sleep. The journey into the unknown had begun, and there was no turning back. 2 weeks had passed since the beginning of the experiment. The once vibrant group of volunteers was now showing unmistakable signs of fatigue. Their once lively eyes were shadowed with dark circles, their movements slower and clumsy. Conversation, which had once flowed freely, was now limited to occasional grunts and half-hearted nods. Dr. Sarah Hayes noted each detail meticulously, her eyes scanning over each subject, scrutinizing their changes. She found herself struggling with a growing sense of unease. She had expected fatigue, it was a given, but seeing the actual manifestation of sleep deprivation was proving more unsettling than she had anticipated. George, a former night shift security guard, used to having his sleep schedule disrupted, was the first to show significant signs. His face was paler, his reactions slower. He had always been a man of few words, but now he barely spoke at all. Instead, he'd stare at the sterile white walls of the facility for long periods, a distant, almost vacant look in his eyes. Next was Lila, a vibrant college student who had joined the experiment driven by her love for challenges. Her incessant chatter had filled the first few days with laughter. Now, her words came out slurred, her sentences often drifting off unfinished. Her once sparkling eyes now held a tired, glazed look. Even the team's resident jokester, Sam, had quieted down. His laughter, which used to echo through the facility, had faded into silence. Now he spent most of his time in the corner, listlessly shuffling a deck of cards, his once infectious energy replaced with an overwhelming lethargy. Sarah noticed the mounting tension in the air. Irritability was creeping into the volunteers' interactions, causing petty squabbles over trivial matters. The once friendly group was slowly splintering, the strain of sleep deprivation chipping away at their camaraderie. Each passing day brought new challenges. Keeping a group of increasingly fatigued and irritable subjects engaged was proving to be a Herculean task. The research team introduced various activities to stimulate their senses and keep their minds active. But each game, each task, seemed to drain more energy from the volunteers than it gave. As Sarah watched her volunteers battle their growing fatigue, she couldn't shake off a creeping sense of dread. This was just the beginning, and the real challenge, she knew, was yet to come. Little did she know how true that would turn out to be. An unsettling quiet descended on the rooms and corridors. Dr. Sarah Hayes watched her subjects closely. The once energetic volunteers had become shadows of their former selves. Their eyes were clouded with fatigue, their movements slow and unsteady. On the 14th sleepless day, the first hallucination occurred. Mark, a 28-year-old writer with a devil-may-care attitude, was the first to break. He jolted from his seat during a routine checkup, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. "There's someone behind you," he stammered, pointing at an empty corner of the sterile room. Sarah turned around, her heart pounding. There was nothing there, just the dull white wall and the persistent hum of the air conditioner. She turned back to Mark, her brows furrowed in concern. "There's nothing there, Mark." But Mark was adamant. He described a figure, a woman with hollow eyes and a silent scream etched on her face. He could see her, he insisted, as clear as day, even as the others looked on with worry and confusion. In the days that followed, more volunteers reported similar visions. Ghostly figures lurking in corridors, ghastly faces reflected in windows, whispers echoing in the silence. The facility, once a symbol of order, had become a playground for unseen terrors. Sarah, the rational mind she was, attributed these sightings to their sleep-deprived brains. She held firm, telling the volunteers that these were mere hallucinations, figments of their exhausted minds. But as the spectral shadows continued to haunt the facility, even Sarah could not shake off an icy chill of fear creeping up her spine. Were they really just hallucinations? Or had they, in their sleepless state, opened doors to a realm best left unexplored? While the city outside hummed its relentless rhythm, the research facility plunged deeper into a world of sleepless terror. The experiment entered its third week. The lights in the research facility buzzed ominously overhead, a stark contrast to the dark, sleepless circles that had formed under the volunteers' eyes. Their expressions had long since lost their initial excitement, replaced by an uneasy mix of exhaustion and fear. Their conversations, once lively and filled with laughter, had dwindled to whispers and strained silences. The hallucinations had become a regular part of their reality. What began as fleeting shadows and whispers in the corners of their vision had evolved into terrifying specters that seemed all too real. The volunteers reported seeing grotesque, shadowy figures lurking just outside their field of vision, disappearing whenever they turned to look. But as sleep continued to elude them, these horrifying apparitions grew bolder. One night, a volunteer named Tom screamed. He had been sitting quietly, staring at the sterile white walls, when he suddenly leapt from his chair, pointing a shaking finger at a corner of the room. His wide eyes were filled with pure terror. "It's there! Can't you see it?" he shrieked. But there was nothing. Nothing but the usual white walls and the ominous hum of the fluorescent lights. Yet to Tom and the others, the entities had begun to take on an almost corporeal form. They described them as shapeless dark masses with piercing, glowing eyes. They would hover at the foot of their beds, creep up behind them while they were eating, and watch them from the darkened corners of their rooms. Their presence was always accompanied by a bone-chilling cold and a paralyzing sense of fear. The physical health of the volunteers began to rapidly decline. Their faces grew pale, and their bodies became frail and weak. Their eyes, bloodshot and wild, reflected the terrifying reality they were living. Yet, they were no closer to sleep than they had been at the start of the experiment. It was clear to everyone, including Dr. Sarah Hayes, that something had gone horribly wrong. What was meant to be a breakthrough in understanding the human need for sleep had turned into a chilling journey into a realm of horror that none of them had been prepared for. The once sterile and controlled environment of the research facility had become a playground for their worst nightmares. Yet sleep, the only escape from this waking horror, remained cruelly out of their grasp. Sarah was in the monitoring room, her eyes scanning the screens showing the volunteers' rooms. It was the third week of the experiment, and the cheerful chatter that once echoed in the facility had been replaced with silence, save for the occasional moan or sob from a volunteer. On one screen, John, a burly construction worker who'd initially scoffed at the idea of sleep deprivation, was hunched in a corner of his room, his eyes wide with terror. He'd been mumbling about shadowy figures for the last 2 days. On another, Lila, a college student who joined for the generous stipend, sat staring at the wall, silent tears streaming down her face. The health parameters on another monitor showed alarming trends: rapid heart rates, irregular breathing, severe weight loss, even hints of organ stress. The data was beyond concerning. It was terrifying. Sarah's stomach churned with guilt. As a scientist, she was trained to push boundaries, to seek the truth, no matter how elusive. But as a human, she couldn't ignore the torment her experiment was inflicting. Her heart ached as she watched the volunteers, once so lively, now on the brink of breaking. Her brother's face flashed in her mind, how he'd looked during his final days battling insomnia. She shook the image away. "Is this what I've become?" she wondered aloud. "A monster, using people for my own curiosity?" Her reflection on the darkened office window offered no answer, only a haunted stare. But then, there was the other side, the breakthrough they were on the cusp of. A deeper understanding of sleep, something that could revolutionize medicine, help countless people. Her brother's voice echoed in her mind, "Keep pushing, Sarah. For me, for all of us." And what of the hallucinations? Could they be real? Had they inadvertently opened a door to another reality? The thought sent chills down her spine. Sarah was at a crossroads. One path led to an uncertain scientific breakthrough, shadowed with fear and guilt. The other to the safety and well-being of the volunteers, but marked with the potential regret of giving up too soon. She took a deep breath, her decision weighing heavily on her shoulders. The harsh reality of her situation was clear. There was no easy choice. The only certain thing was that her next step would define not only the course of the experiment, but also her entire career, her very humanity. The research facility was shrouded in an oppressive stillness. The once vibrant group of volunteers now barely resembled their former selves. Their faces were gaunt, eyes wide and haunted from the horrifying visions that plagued them day and night. Sarah observed them from behind the one-way mirror, her heart sinking at the sight. Inside the observation room, Tom, one of the volunteers, suddenly stood up. His face was contorted with fear. He pointed at an empty corner of the room, his body trembling violently. "Can't you see it?" he screamed, his voice echoing through the silence. "It's right there!" But there was nothing. Sarah could see only the sterile white walls, the worn-out furniture, and the terrified faces of the other volunteers. Yet Tom's terror was palpable. He backed away, collided with a chair, and fell. His eyes never left the empty corner. Sarah rushed into the room, her heart pounding in her chest. The other researchers followed her, their faces pale. Tom was on the floor now, thrashing and yelling about the unseen entity. His screams pierced the quiet facility, filling the sterile corridors with raw fear. Sarah kneeled beside him, trying to calm him down, but his eyes were fixed on the vacant corner, his body shaking uncontrollably. Sarah felt a cold dread gripping her. She knew they had pushed too far, stepped into territories unknown and terrifying. "We need to stop the experiment," she gasped, turning towards the other researchers. The words hung heavily in the air, echoing her guilt and regret. They were supposed to study sleep deprivation, not drive people into madness. It was a terrible mistake, she realized, one that could no longer be ignored. The rest of the day descended into chaos. Emergency medical staff arrived, evacuating the hysterical Tom and checking the other volunteers. The once bustling research facility now felt like a haunted house, filled with dread and an eerie silence. Sarah was left alone in the observation room, the horrifying scenes replaying in her mind. As the night descended on the city outside, the facility's lights seemed dimmer, the shadows longer. She couldn't shake off the chilling sensation that they had opened a door to a realm best left unexplored. The hallucinations were no longer just a byproduct of sleep deprivation. They were something far more sinister, something that lurked in the depths of prolonged wakefulness. The breaking point had arrived, and everything was about to change. Sarah gazed out at the city lights, wondering how the experiment had gone so wrong. The once buzzing research facility lay silent, its sterile white walls echoing with the ghosts of the past. The corridors, which once teemed with restless volunteers, were now a cold labyrinth of memory. The experiment was over. Sarah stood in the abandoned monitoring room, staring at the blank screens that once displayed the suffering of sleep-deprived souls. The ceaseless cacophony of the city outside filtered through the window, indifferent to the nightmare that had unfolded within these walls. Feelings of guilt washed over her. Each piece of medical equipment, each empty bed, was a reminder of the promises she'd made to the volunteers. Promises of safety, understanding, and above all, groundbreaking scientific discovery. All they had discovered was terror. Her gaze fell on the corner of the room, where Tom had crumbled in fear, crying out to invisible horrors. The echo of his screams still haunted the room. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to block the memory, but it was etched deep into her mind. The aftermath of the experiment was a whirlwind. The facility was shut down almost immediately. Emergency medical teams were called in. Each participant was taken to the hospital, their conditions kept away from prying public eyes. The official statement was clear. The experiment was a failure. Sarah left the silent facility, stepping out into the bright New York sunlight. The city went about its day, oblivious to the spectral horrors that had breached their reality. But for Sarah, the world had changed. The boundaries between the sleep-deprived mind and an unthinkable reality had blurred. She walked aimlessly, the city's noise a distant hum. She thought about the volunteers. She thought about their suffering, their fear. But most of all, she thought about the entities, those terrifying figures born from the absence of sleep. Were they merely hallucinations, or had they truly stumbled upon a realm best left unexplored? The questions haunted her. The experiment had scarred her, but it hadn't quenched her thirst for knowledge. If anything, it had ignited a new desire, a desire to understand the limits of the human mind, the mysteries of sleep, and the entities that lurked in its absence. As the sun set over the city, Sarah made a vow. She wouldn't let the experiment define her. Instead, she'd use it as a stepping stone, a guide into the unexplored depths of human consciousness. The horrors of the sleep experiment were over, but for Sarah, a new chapter was just beginning.